The phone rang as I was making tea. June Radcliffe? The voice sounded official. I knew right away that the news wasn't going to be good. Good news rarely came with that tone. Yes, that's me, I answered, setting the cup aside. Mrs. Radcliffe, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband, Samuel Radcliffe, ex-husband, I corrected. Ex-husband, I corrected. I'd gotten into the habit of specifying that status over 30 years. 30 years is enough time to consider a divorce finalized. Yes, I apologize. Your ex-husband died of a heart attack last night. I'm calling from the coroner's office. I sank slowly into the chair. My tea was getting cold in my cup, and my mind was racing with scattered thoughts. Samuel is dead. The man I had lived with for 22 years, the father of my only son, no longer existed in this world. Are you there, Mrs. Radcliffe? A voice brought me back to reality. Yes, I'm here. Thank you for letting me know. When and where is the funeral? A few more minutes of mechanical conversation about dates, addresses, and formalities. I wrote everything down in a notebook in neat handwriting that hasn't changed over the years. Finished talking, I stared at the cooled tea. It was strange how my ex-husband's death had affected me more deeply than I'd realized. We hadn't really spoken in the last 5 years, only formal calls at Christmas and Elliot's birthday. Our son was our only link, and it had thinned to the point of invisibility. Samuel and I. Those words once sounded natural, one and the same. We met in Alta Vista when we were both in our early 20s. He an aspiring antiques dealer with ambition and charm, me a young literature teacher. On our first date, Samuel brought me an antique bookmark made of silver with an engraved pattern of ivy leaves. For a woman who understands the value of old things, he said then. I stood up and walked over to the bookshelf. The bookmark was still there, in the Whitman tome. My fingers found it easily, thin, cool, with the silver tarnished by time. Strange, why had I kept it? Maybe because it wasn't just a gift from Samuel, but a part of myself, a teacher who believed in the power of words and stories. Elliot, I need to call my son. The thought echoed with a mixture of anxiety and fatigue. Our relationship was like walking through a minefield. You never knew what phrase would set it off. The last time we'd seen each other was at my sister Helen's funeral 5 years ago. Elliot showed up in the middle of the service and left right afterward, barely exchanging a word with me. 43 years old and acting like a resentful teenager. I picked up my phone and looked up his number in my contacts. It rang, 1, 2, 3. Then an answering machine with Elliot's mechanical voice. You've reached Elliot Radcliffe. Leave a message. Elliot, it's Mom. I need to let you know. I hesitated for words. Your father died yesterday. Heart attack. The funeral's next Wednesday in Alta Vista. Call me back, please. I put the phone down and looked out the window. Outside the window was my little garden that I'd been cultivating for the last 15 years, since I'd retired and moved back to Alta Vista. Samuel chose to stay in the big city, continuing to build his business, and I returned to where our story began. Perhaps it was my way of trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. About 20 minutes later, I dialed Elliot's number again. Once again, it went to voicemail. I sent the message, "It's important. Please call me back." The whole day went by in a blur. I watered the flowers, made lunch, went through the paperwork for my tax return. But my thoughts kept returning to Samuel and Elliot, the two men in my life, one gone forever, the other as if he'd never really showed up. That evening, the phone rang. My son's name popped up on the screen. Mom? His voice sounded like he was calling from another world. In a way, it was. Elliot's world, with its recording studio, parties, and ambition, hadn't intersected with mine in years. Yes, Elliot, I just saw this online about my father. Is it true? Yes, I replied, heart attack. I got a call this morning. A pause. I could hear him breathing. When's the funeral? Wednesday, in Alta Vista, 3 o'clock in the afternoon at St. James Chapel. I'll be there, he said after a pause. I'll book a ticket for Tuesday. Something in his voice made me wary. Elliot's sudden interest in a father he hadn't seen in years seemed suspicious. Are you sure? You don't have to come if you have business to attend to, I said, trying to understand his motives. No, I have to be there. He is my father, after all. The father you've ignored for the last 10 years, I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. You don't know he left a will? Elliot asked with a casual nonchalance that explained everything. I don't know the details, Elliot, I answered dryly. You can stay at my place if you want. Thank you, but I'd rather book a hotel room. I don't want to embarrass you. Typical Elliot, always keeping his distance, always ready to back off. Whatever you say. Call me when you get there. I will. Bye, Mom. See you, Elliot. I hung up and stared at the phone for a long time. And that was it. Elliot would be attending his father's funeral, hoping to receive an inheritance from the man he defiantly cut out of his life years ago. How does his mother feel when she realizes that her only son is only interested in his dead father's money? Not grief, not a desire to say goodbye, not regret for lost opportunities for reconciliation, but only material gain, bitterness, disappointment. These were too simple words for the complex tangle of emotions. I poured myself a glass of wine, a habit I'd acquired since my divorce, one glass of red wine in the evening, not to intoxicate, but to dull the sharp edges of loneliness. Samuel had always criticized this habit of mine, considering it a sign of weakness. June, you let yourself be comforted too easily, he used to say, and it was his lack of comfort that led to our breakup, his inability to realize that I needed something more than the material wealth and social status of a successful antiques dealer's wife. Samuel was obsessed with building a legacy, a collection, a business, a reputation. I just wanted to live. Elliot absorbed the worst qualities of both of us, my tendency toward self-isolation and loneliness, and my father's obsession with success and status. It was amazing how the mixture of two less than ideal people made a third, embodying all of their flaws and almost none of their virtues. I took a sip of wine and walked over to the bookshelf. I pulled out an old photo album, the only one I'd brought with me after the divorce. Our wedding, Elliot's birth, the early years in Alta Vista when Samuel was just starting his business and I was teaching at the local school. Here's the three of us on a picnic by the lake. Elliot is about 5 years old, laughing, showing the gap between his front teeth. Samuel looks young and energetic, his hand resting on my shoulder. And I look happy. Was it a trick of the camera, or was I really happy at that moment? I closed the album and returned it to the shelf. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. The next few days passed in the hassle of dealing with the funeral. Although I wasn't Samuel's next of kin, I was the only person willing to make the arrangements. He had no other loved ones, no brothers, sisters, or even cousins with whom he would keep in touch. Elliot was his only heir, but his son showed no interest in practical matters. I had to contact the funeral home, order flowers, place an ad in the local paper. I never thought I'd be in charge of my ex-husband's funeral. But then again, isn't that the essence of marriage even after it ends? We remain bound by invisible threads of commitment and shared history. The night before Elliot arrived, I hardly slept at all. I tossed and turned in bed, thinking about my upcoming meeting with my son. I knew he was only coming because of the inheritance. I knew he'd be distant and cold. And yet part of me, the silly, sentimental part, had hoped that his father's death would change something in him, make him reevaluate his life and his relationship with me. In the morning, I put the house in order. Even though Elliot had said he'd stay in a hotel, I made his favorite apple and cinnamon pie, a recipe I'd inherited from my mother. It was probably stupid. Elliot had outgrown his childhood cravings, and we weren't likely to have a family tea party with pies. But my hands reached for the flour and apples, as if trying to bring back the time when we were a family. I looked at my watch. Elliot's plane was due to land in an hour. He promised to call me when he got to the hotel. In the meantime, I decided to double-check all the funeral documents. Samuel's will was to be read by his lawyer after the ceremony. I didn't know what it contained, but I guessed it wouldn't give Elliot what he'd hoped for. Samuel was always trying to look more successful than he was. A beautiful facade and emptiness behind it was what his business had been in recent years. Elliot probably thought his father had left a sizable fortune. The thought made me chuckle bitterly. What a surprise awaits my son. When the ringing of the phone broke the silence of the house, I knew it was Elliot. His flight had landed half an hour ago, and he'd been faithful to his punctuality, calling exactly when he'd promised. "I'm in Alta Vista," he said in lieu of a greeting. "I've just checked into the Riverside." The Riverside is the most expensive hotel in our little town. Elliot had always had a knack for spending money on ostentatious luxury. "Okay," I replied. "Are you planning to rest or do you want to meet tonight?" A pause. I could almost see him weighing his options, figuring out how to make the most of a visit to a hometown he had no affection for. "I think we should have dinner together," he said at last, with casual casualness. "I've made a reservation at the Belvedere for 7, the most expensive restaurant in addition to the most expensive hotel." Elliot was being true to himself. "Okay, I'll be there," I said, thinking I'd have to wear something more formal than my usual pants and sweater. "Great, I'll see you later, Mom." I hung up the phone and looked at the clock. It was about 5. I had 2 hours to pack and get ready to meet the son I hadn't seen in 5 years. What dress to wear to dinner with a man who had become practically a stranger? I chose the navy blue dress I'd bought for my sister's funeral. It was elegant enough for the Belvedere, but it didn't look like I was dressing up to meet Elliot. I put my hair up in a simple bun and put on a little makeup, just a little, just so I wouldn't look tired. It started raining as I left the house. Small, drizzling, it shrouded the city in a gray veil, softening the contours of the buildings and turning the streetlights into blurry balls of light. I grabbed an umbrella and hailed a cab at my age. I didn't want to wander around in the rain, even if it was only a 15-minute walk to the restaurant. Belvedere was located in an old mansion on a hill overlooking the river. Despite its pretentious name and high prices, the place had always seemed tasteless to me. Too much gilding, too much ostentatious luxury. Just like Elliot, I arrived at 7 sharp, but my son was already waiting for me at a table by the window. He stood up when he saw me, and I couldn't help noticing how he'd changed over the years. Drier, stiffer, with wrinkles around his eyes and gray hair on his temples. He was still handsome, though, with the cold, ostentatious beauty he'd inherited from his father. "Mom," he leaned over and touched my cheek lightly with his lips. He smelled of expensive cologne and cigarettes, even though he claimed he'd quit smoking at 30. "Elliot," I smiled slightly, "you look good." "So do you," he said, giving me a quick, appraising look. We sat down. The waiter immediately materialized beside us to take our drink orders. "A bottle of Chateau Margaux, 2010, Elliot said, not looking at the wine list. "If you have one, of course." "Certainly, sir." The waiter bowed his head and left. "Chateau Margaux?" I raised an eyebrow. "You've become a wine connoisseur?" "I just like the good stuff." Elliot shrugged. "Life's too short to drink bad wine." Didn't your father say that? Your father said a lot of things, I replied calmly. Not all of them were wise. Elliot grinned, but there was something like irritation in his eyes. He'd always reacted painfully to any criticism of Samuel, despite their complicated relationship. Or maybe it was because of them. How's your studio? I asked, changing the subject. Last I heard, you were recording some indie band that went viral. Moondogs, Elliot nodded. Yeah, that was a successful project. Working with some new artists now, expanding. Business is going well. He spoke with a swagger that always reminded me of Samuel in his best years. The same energy, the same belief in his own infallibility, and the same blindness to pitfalls. The waiter returned with the wine, showed me the bottle, uncorked it with ostentatious courtesies, and poured Elliot a little to sample. My son took a sip, nodded with a look of connoisseurship, and the waiter filled our glasses. What shall we drink to? I asked, raising my glass. Elliot hesitated, then raised his own. To my father, he said, to his memory. I nodded silently and took a sip. The wine was tart and rich, with notes of black currant and oak. Samuel would have loved it. How long ago was the last time you spoke to your father? I asked as the waiter stepped away. Elliot tensed slightly. About a year ago, he answered, scrutinizing the menu. He called to wish me a happy birthday. How did the conversation go? It was fine. Elliot shrugged. The usual. He asked about the business, and I gave him a general outline. He talked about his recent acquisitions. Nothing major. I nodded, not showing that I knew he was lying. Samuel told me that Elliot hadn't returned his call and then sent a short message thanking him for the congratulations. They hadn't spoken in years. How's his business been lately? Elliot asked, trying to look nonchalant. Was he still working with that Japanese collector? That was it. The real reason for his questions about his last conversation with his father. Elliot was trying to find out how profitable Samuel's business was, calculating the size of a possible inheritance. As far as I know, his partnership with Mr. Tanaka ended a few years ago, I answered. After that unfortunate business with the Chinese porcelain. The bad business? Elliot frowned. I hadn't heard about that. Of course you hadn't. He wasn't interested in his father's affairs unless they concerned him directly. Samuel had invested a considerable sum in a collection that turned out to be a forgery, I explained. It was a serious blow to his reputation and his finances. Elliot tensed visibly. But he'd gotten over it? Recovered? Everything looked fine on the outside. I paused. Your father was always able to keep a straight face, even when things weren't going well. Elliot sipped his wine in silence, thinking about what he'd heard. His face remained impassive, but I could see his brain working, calculating possible inheritances, adjusting expectations. The waiter returned to take my order. Elliot chose the steak. I chose the fish. When the waiter left again, there was silence between us. Elliot was looking at the other diners in the restaurant, and I was looking at him. My son, flesh and flesh of my flesh, was both close and distant at the same time. How had this happened? At what point did we become strangers? Are you still working with that partner? I asked, breaking the silence. Wasn't his name Nigel? Knox, Elliot corrected. Yes, we're still together. He handles the financial side, and I handle the creative side. How's that working out for you? Elliot grimaced a little. It varies. We have different views on some things, but on the whole, we complement each other pretty well. I could tell from his tone that it wasn't as smooth as he was trying to make it seem. Perhaps that was the reason for his sudden interest in his father's inheritance, business problems he didn't want to admit. What about your personal life? I asked. Are you still seeing that girl, the designer? Olivia? No, we broke up a year ago. Elliot dismissed it as if it were a bad deal, not someone he'd been with for 3 years. I'm alone now. Business takes up too much of my time. Typical Elliot excuse. Business had always been his priority, and his excuse for not having a deep relationship. He was so much like his father in that it was sometimes frightening. What about you, Mom? He asked with feigned interest. Are you still enjoying your secluded life in Alta Vista? I wouldn't call my life secluded, I countered. I have friends. I run a book club at the library, and I volunteer at the local school. That sounds peaceful, Elliot said, and I caught a note of condescension in his voice. Not everyone wants constant movement and change, Elliot, I replied. Sometimes stability isn't a lack of ambition, but a conscious choice. He shrugged, clearly unconvinced. For him, as for Samuel, life without the constant pursuit of success seemed like a waste of time. Our entrees arrived. Elliot began eating immediately, cutting the steak with surgical precision. I picked at my fish without much appetite. Tell me about your father's last years, Elliot asked, chewing on a piece of meat. What did he do? How did he feel? I don't know much, I admitted. We didn't talk much, but from what I understand, he was still working, albeit on a smaller scale. His health began to fail a few years ago. Heart problems, high blood pressure. He never mentioned it. Elliot frowned. Your father didn't like to show weakness, I said. You have to remember that. Elliot nodded, continuing to eat. Then, as if by chance, he asked, What about his collection? Is it still impressive? Oh, here's the thing. Samuel's collection was antiques, rare works of art that he'd collected all his life. Elliot expected it to be a significant part of his inheritance. The last time I'd been to his house was 3 years ago, I said carefully. The collection seemed diminished. I think he'd sold some of it. Sold it? Elliot almost choked on his wine. Why? Was he in financial trouble? I couldn't say for sure, I shrugged. Samuel didn't tell me the details of his affairs, but it seemed to me that the house didn't look as rich as it used to be. Elliot tapped his fork thoughtfully on the edge of his plate. His face was a mixture of concern and annoyance. I'm surprised he didn't say anything about it, he muttered. When would he have, Elliot? I couldn't help but rebuke him. You'd barely spoken to each other the last few years. My son raised his head, his eyes narrowed. Don't start, Mom. You know my relationship with his father has always been complicated. Complicated? I grinned bitterly. You had no relationship at all. You ignored his calls, didn't answer his letters. He tried to contact you until the very end. And what was I supposed to do? Elliot raised his voice, then, noticing the stares of neighboring tables, lowered his tone. He was never interested in me as a person. To him, I was just an extension of himself, another project. You, of all people, should understand that. There was some truth in what he said. Samuel did treat his son as an extension of himself, an heir not only to his property, but also to his ambitions. But that didn't justify a complete breakup. He's changed, Elliot, I said quietly, especially in recent years. Illness has made him reconsider a lot of things. He talked about you, asked how you were doing. It's too late for change, Elliot said. All my life, he's put his ambition and reputation above everything else, above you, above me. And now that he's dead, you expect me to grieve? I don't expect anything, I replied tiredly. I'm just stating the facts. He was your father, with all his faults. And he tried to right his wrongs, even if it was too late. Elliot snorted and went back to his steak. I understood his resentment. Samuel had indeed been a difficult father, demanding, often distant, focused on his own affairs more than his family. But in recent years, as his health began to fail him, he'd tried to bond with his son. Elliot, on the other hand, was too wrapped up in his own ambitions and resentments to respond to these attempts. We finished our meal in silence. Elliot ordered dessert, a chocolate fondant with vanilla ice cream. I limited myself to a cup of tea. Tomorrow's the funeral, Elliot said, stirring the melted ice cream into the chocolate fondue filling. Do you know who else will be there? Not many people, I replied. A few business colleagues, old friends. Samuel hadn't been particularly social in recent years. What about the reading of the will? He asked bluntly. When will that be? After the funeral, I looked him straight in the eye. In the office of Mr. Pritchard, his lawyer. You'll be notified. Elliot nodded, clearly satisfied with that information. Are you staying in Alta Vista for a while? I asked, knowing the answer in advance. It depends, he said evasively. I have things to do at the studio, but I can work remotely for a few days if I need to. If I need to deal with the inheritance, I translated his words. I understand. I finished my tea. Well, it's getting late. I think I should go home. I'll drive you, Elliot offered. I rented a car at the airport. Thanks, but I'd rather call a cab, I said. I don't want to distract you from your plans. He didn't insist, which didn't surprise me. Elliot always made formal offers of help, secretly hoping they'd be declined. Whatever you say, he beckoned to the waiter and paid, tossing his credit card carelessly on the table. I'll see you at the funeral tomorrow. We left the restaurant together. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and cool. Elliot helped me into a cab, pecked me on the cheek, and headed toward his rental car, a shiny black Mercedes that must have cost him a fortune for the day. As the cab pulled away, I stared at my son's receding figure and thought about how much of Samuel was in him. The same gait, the same gestures, the same obsession with the trappings of success, and the same inability to see the real life behind them. Tomorrow would be the funeral, and Elliot would learn the truth about his father's business, a truth that I was sure would come as an unpleasant surprise. The day of the funeral was unexpectedly clear. The autumn sun illuminated Alta Vista with a soft golden light, as if trying to soften the somberness of the event. I woke up early with a heavy heart and a vague sense of foreboding. It wasn't that I was grieving for Samuel. Our marriage had ended too long ago, and the wounds we'd inflicted on each other had healed with the scars of habit and indifference. But death always makes you look back, reevaluate the past, think about what might have been. I put on the dark gray suit I'd bought a few years ago, especially for such occasions. At my age, you have to be prepared for funerals. They happen more and more often. Friends, ex-colleagues, neighbors. And now, Samuel, not a husband, but someone I'd lived with for a good part of my life. Elliot promised to pick me up at 2. The ceremony was set for 3 at St. James Chapel, an old stone church downtown. I was sitting in the living room, going through the pictures I'd decided to show at the wake, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. My son looked impeccable in a black suit and dark tie. His face was impassive, but I noticed the tension in the line of his shoulders and compressed lips. "Ready?" he asked, giving me a quick glance. "Yes." I picked up my purse and the folder of photos. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Elliot answered dryly. "I just want this to be over." We got into his rental car and drove to the church. Alta Vista floated by outside the window. The familiar streets, the old buildings, the park where Elliot had played as a child. He didn't look around, focused on the road, as if trying to avoid any memories. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "your father used to come to this park a lot in the last few years. Said it helped him think." Elliot didn't answer, only gripped the steering wheel harder. "He did try to contact you." I continued quietly, especially in the last few months. Mom, not now, Elliot said. I don't want to talk about this. I was silent, staring out the window. My son had always had a knack for building walls, another trait he'd inherited from his father. The church was already half full when we arrived. I recognized a few of Samuel's old friends, colleagues in the antique business, a few locals, not as many people as one might expect for someone who has lived in this town most of his life. But Samuel had always kept his distance, favoring business relationships over personal ones. We sat in the front row. The casket was in front of the altar, closed, just like I'd asked. I didn't want my last memory of Samuel to be his face, contorted by illness and death. The service was short and low-key. The priest spoke about life and death, forgiveness and remembrance. Elliot sat next to me, straight and still, like a statue. I could see no tears in his eyes, only emptiness and perhaps a pent-up anger. When the service was over, people came up to us, offering condolences. Elliot responded mechanically, with a polite smile that didn't affect his eyes. I accepted the sympathy more sincerely, but I too felt a strange detachment. Samuel had died to me long before his physical death. After the cemetery, where the coffin was lowered into the ground to the quiet singing of the choir, there was a wake at a small restaurant nearby. People talked about Samuel, remembered stories from his life, and drank to his memory. Elliot stood at the window with a glass of whiskey, which he hardly drank, and looked out at the street. Mr. Radcliffe, an older man with glasses and thinning gray hair, approached him. I'm Harvey Pritchard, your father's attorney. My condolences. Elliot nodded slightly, shaking the outstretched hand. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you about the will, Pritchard continued. If you don't mind, we could go to my office after the wake. There are a few matters that need immediate attention. I saw Elliot tense up. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for since the day he'd learned of his father's death. Of course, he answered. When you're ready. Pritchard nodded and stepped away, mingling with the other guests. Elliot looked at me, and I saw a strange mixture of anticipation and worry in his eyes. Will you come with me? He asked suddenly. I was surprised. Elliot rarely asked me for anything, preferring to handle things on his own. If you want, I answered. Yes. He took a sip of whiskey. I think that would be the right thing to do. The wake went on for another hour or so. People slowly drifted away, saying their goodbyes and condolences. Finally, when only a few people were left, Pritchard approached us again. If you're ready, my office is only 2 blocks away. We went outside. The day was drawing toward evening. The sun was already behind the rooftops, and the air was getting cooler. I buttoned my coat, feeling suddenly tired. Too many emotions for one day. Pritchard's office was in an old brick building that had once been a bank. Everything inside smelled old. Dark wood paneling, massive furniture, bookcases filled with legal tomes. The lawyer ushered us into his office and invited us to sit down. Before we begin, he said, pulling a folder from a desk drawer, I should point out that the last changes to the will were made 6 months ago, when Mr. Radcliffe's health began to fail. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the folder in Pritchard's hands. As to the inheritance, continued the lawyer, opening the folder, I must say at once that the situation is complicated. What do you mean? Elliot asked, and I heard a note of concern in his voice. Pritchard cleared his throat. I'm afraid Mr. Radcliffe's business has not been as good as it might seem in recent years. His business had run into serious financial difficulties after failed investments and several deals that didn't live up to expectations. I could see Elliot's face slowly changing, a realization in his eyes. You mean, he began. What I'm saying, Pritchard interrupted him gently, is that after all the debts are paid and the unfinished business matters are settled, the inheritance will be minimal. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his face pale. Minimal? What exactly does that mean? Pritchard sighed and pulled some documents out of a folder. Your father's house is under foreclosure. The bank will probably sell it to pay off the mortgage. Much of his collection has been sold in recent years or is being pledged to lenders. That leaves some personal belongings, a small amount in a bank account, and insurance that will mostly cover funeral expenses and remaining medical bills. Elliot sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the papers on the desk. I could see his hands resting in his lap, clenched into fists. It's impossible, he said at last. Dad had always been successful. His business? Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Radcliffe, Pritchard said sympathetically. Your father was a proud man. He didn't want anyone to know about his financial difficulties. Even I only learned the full picture in the last months of his life. I sat in silence, watching my son's reaction. I suspected that Samuel's affairs were not going well, but even I had no idea of the extent of the problems. Is there anything else? Elliot asked in a muffled voice. Pritchard nodded and pulled out another document. Your father left you a letter. He held out a sealed envelope. And one more thing. The lawyer opened a desk drawer and took out a small wooden box. This is a family heirloom that has been passed down in your family for generations. Your father insisted that you inherit it, despite the financial difficulties. Elliot took the box and the letter, his hands trembling slightly. I could see the mixture of emotions on his face: disappointment, anger, confusion. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, Pritchard offered. Elliot shook his head. Not now, he said. I need to think about all this. We left Pritchard's office in heavy silence. Elliot walked ahead, clutching the box and the letter in his hand, his shoulders tense, his gait sharp. I followed him, not trying to start a conversation. I knew any words now would be taken in stride. When we got into the car, Elliot tossed the box and the letter into the back seat and started the engine. His face was stone, his eyes staring straight ahead. Did you know? He asked suddenly, not looking at me. I guessed he was in trouble. I answered honestly, but I didn't know how serious it was. Elliot pulled out of the parking lot abruptly. All his life he's talked about the importance of reputation, of legacy, of creating something meaningful. His voice shook with restrained anger. And what's the result? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I wanted to say something comforting, but I realized the futility of any words at this point. Elliot wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for an outlet for his frustration and anger. We drove in silence. When we pulled up to my house, I expected Elliot to just drop me off and drive away, but he stopped the engine abruptly. Can I come in? He asked. I need a drink. I nodded, surprised by his request. At home, I poured him a whiskey and myself a glass of wine. Elliot sat in his chair, the box and the letter on the coffee table in front of him. He stared at them, but made no attempt to open them. All this time, he said, taking a sip of whiskey, I thought he was leaving me something significant. Not that I needed the money, but it would be an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement of what? I asked softly. That I was important to him, Elliot answered bitterly. That all those years of estrangement meant something to him. I looked at my son, a successful, confident man who looked like a lost child at this moment. Elliot, I said quietly, your father loved you. In his own way, complicated, imperfect, but he loved you. He shook his head. If he had, he would have found a way to tell me while he was alive. No conditions, no expectations, just because I was his son. Before I could answer, Elliot's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. "It's Knox," he said. "Dash, my partner. I'm surprised he's calling so late." Elliot answered, putting it on speakerphone, and I heard his partner's excited voice. "Elliot, thank God you answered. We're in trouble." "What's wrong?" Elliot asked, straightening up in his chair. "The investors withdrew the financing." Knox's voice sounded tense. "The whole Amber Wave deal is falling apart." I saw Elliot's face turn even paler. "What? Why?" "We agreed on everything before I left." "There was a problem," Knox said uncertainly. "Remember that guy, Brennan, the one I brought in as a potential investor?" "Yeah," Elliot said cautiously. "He wasn't who he said he was." Knox sounded desperate. His firm was a sham. He used our negotiations to gain access to our clients and technology. Now he's offering them the same services at lower prices, using our expertise. Elliot slowly set his glass down on the table. "You made a deal with him without my knowledge?" His voice was dangerously calm. Pause. "I thought it was a good opportunity," Knox finally replied. Dash. "He offered favorable terms, and I signed the preliminary contract." "You did what?" Elliot jumped up from his chair. "What the hell, Knox? We agreed that no serious decisions were to be made without discussing them together." I know. Knox's voice sounded guilty, but he was in a hurry to make a decision. He said that if we didn't sign now, he'd go to a competitor. I thought I was doing what was best for the studio. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, his breathing becoming heavy. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Knox answered after a pause. "Three of our biggest clients have already canceled their contracts. The bank has frozen our line of credit. And there's the threat of a lawsuit from Amber Wave for breach of prior agreements." I could see each word hitting Elliot as if physically. His shoulders slumped, his face contorted with shock and rage. "We could lose the studio, Elliot." Knox's voice shook. "We need money now. I was hoping that maybe your father's inheritance." "There is no inheritance," Elliot cut him off. "Only debts and empty promises." Silence on the other end of the line. "Then we're screwed," Knox finally said. "I'll be on the first flight out in the morning," Elliot said. "Don't do anything, absolutely nothing until I get back. You've done enough already." He disconnected the call and tossed the phone on the desk. Then he sank into the chair and covered his face with his hands. I sat in silence, not knowing what to say. In one day, my son had lost not only his illusions about his father's inheritance, but perhaps his life's work. "It's over," he said finally, lowering his hands. "The studio I've been working on for 10 years. Everything I've accomplished on my own. Because of one mistake, one bad decision." There was a desperation in his voice that made my heart sink. Despite all our difficulties, he was still my son, and his pain was my pain. "Maybe it's not that bad," I said, trying to find words of comfort. "When you come back, you'll be able to assess the situation more soberly. Maybe there's a way out." Elliot shook his head. "You don't understand, Mom. In the music business, reputation is everything. If clients leave, if there are rumors of problems, it's over. Nobody wants to work with a sinking ship." He took the glass and finished the whiskey in a gulp. "It's funny," he said with a bitter chuckle. "I always tried to be different from my father. I ended up following his path, built something that seemed solid and successful, and lost it all because of pride and bad decisions." I looked at my son with pain and sympathy. In that moment, he really was more like Samuel than ever. The same brokenness, the same mixture of pride and despair. "You're not your father, Elliot," I said quietly, "and all is not lost." He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. "What am I gonna do, Mom?" he asked, and there was a confusion in his voice that I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. In that moment, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness that my son was suffering, and satisfaction that he was finally seeing the true value of the things he thought were important. Get some sleep first, I replied gently. Things look different in the morning. Then go back and fight for what really matters to you. Elliot nodded, his gaze falling on the box and the letter that still lay untouched. I don't even know if I want to read this, he said, pointing to the letter. What could he tell me now that he hadn't told me when he was alive? I didn't answer. It was a choice Elliot had to make for himself. The morning after the funeral began with the smell of coffee and muffled voices. I woke up early, a habit developed over the years. Elliot, contrary to my expectations, hadn't gone to a hotel, but stayed the night in his old room. Apparently, yesterday's news had broken him to the point where he sought refuge within the walls that had once been his home. Going down to the kitchen, I found my son at the table with his laptop and phone. His hair was disheveled, shadows under his eyes, and his shirt was wrinkled, the telltale signs of a sleepless night. Good morning, I said, heading for the coffee maker. Elliot gave me a distracted glance and nodded, keeping his eyes on the screen. I told you, Knox. His voice sounded strained. Check all the clauses in the contract. There should be a force majeure clause. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from him, trying not to interfere with the conversation. Elliot gestured with his free hand, his face a mixture of irritation and anxiety. No, I can't fly out today. He ran a hand through his hair. All flights have been canceled because of technical problems at the airport. The earliest is tomorrow morning. I could see how this news increased his anxiety. He ended the call and threw the phone on the table with such force that he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. Is there a problem? I asked, though the answer was obvious. Disaster, Elliot answered, staring at the laptop screen. Knox had signed a contract with this adventurer without a background check. Now we have 24 hours to post bail on the suit, or the court will seize all the studio's assets. How much money do we need? 50,000. Elliot grinned bitterly. It's not that much money under normal circumstances, but all our accounts are frozen, our credit line is closed, and our personal savings are insufficient. I can't even go back to deal with this mess personally. I looked at my son with sympathy. In one 24-hour period, his world had turned upside down. Yesterday, a successful businessman who'd come to his father's funeral hoping for an inheritance. Today, a man on the brink of ruin, stuck in the city he'd always wanted to leave. Maybe I could help, I offered. I have a small savings. Elliot shook his head. Thanks, Mom, but your savings won't be enough. And I don't want to drag you into this. He picked up the phone again and dialed the number. David? It's Elliot Radcliffe. Remember we were talking about a possible collaboration? Pause. Yeah, that's right. Listen, I have a business proposition for you, an urgent one. I got up quietly and left the kitchen so as not to interfere with his negotiations. In the living room, I noticed that Samuel's box and letter were still lying untouched on the coffee table. Elliot still hadn't opened them. The next few hours passed in a tense rhythm. Elliot moved between the kitchen and the living room, constantly making calls, sending emails, checking some documents. His face grew more and more gaunt, his voice more and more harsh. I tried to offer him something to eat, but he waved me off, saying there was no time. By noon, it was clear that his attempts to save the situation remotely were failing. Shit. He threw the phone on the couch after another call. No one wants to contact us until the situation with the lawsuit is clear, and it won't be cleared up until we post the damn bail. I sat in the chair with a book I wasn't reading, watching my son flounder. It hurt to see him like this, confused, angry, helpless, Elliot had always sought control, always had a plan. Now he was like a bird hitting glass. Maybe we should take a break. I suggested it. Get some air, clear your head. There's no time, he said, turning back to his laptop. Every minute counts. He dialed the number again, but after a short conversation, he hung up in frustration. It's useless, he said, falling back on the couch. No one will give money as collateral for a studio that might go bankrupt. It's a vicious circle. I went over and sat down next to him, feeling a strange mixture of sympathy and relief. Yes, relief, exactly. For the first time in years, Elliot needed me. For the first time, he was there not because of obligation or profit, but because he had nowhere else to go. Tell me about the studio, I asked. About how it started. Elliot looked at me in surprise, but after a pause, he started talking. Reluctantly at first, then more and more animatedly, about how he started with a small room and used equipment, how he found his first customers, how he met Knox, who brought financial expertise and connections, how they gradually grew, bringing in more and more big-name artists, expanding the studio. This was my baby, he said bitterly, something I created on my own, without my father's help. He always said that I had chosen an unreliable business, that the music industry was a lottery, and I wanted to prove him wrong. And you did, I said softly. 10 years of successful business isn't a fluke. Elliot shook his head. And now it's all falling apart because of one mistake. Maybe my father was right about me. Those words hit something deep inside me. How many times had I heard Samuel criticize Elliot's choices, his decisions, his lifestyle? How many times have I seen my son try to prove himself to a father who was never satisfied? Your father wasn't right about a lot of things, I said firmly, especially about you. Elliot looked at me for a long moment. Why didn't you ever say that when he was alive? Why didn't you defend me when he smashed all my endeavors to smithereens? That's it. The question I knew would be asked sooner or later. The accusation I deserved. I was afraid of him, Elliot, I admitted quietly. Not physically, no. I was afraid of his confidence, his ability to make me question my own judgment. When you live with someone who's always right, always sure, always has the last word, you start to lose yourself. Elliot was silent, but I could see that he was listening intently. When you were little, I tried to protect you, I continued. But Samuel had a way of turning any confrontation into proof of my incompetence. You're too soft, June. You're making him look weak. The world is tough, and he needs to be prepared. I was quiet for a moment, gathering my thoughts. And then, when you got older, I thought you could stand up to it on your own, that you were stronger than me. And when you fought, I stayed away because I was afraid I'd make it worse. You left me alone against him, Elliot said, the old pain in his voice. Do you know how many times I've waited for you to step in, to say something in my defense? I know, I said, tears welling up in my throat. And I'm sorry. I was a bad mother. Not bad. Elliot shook his head. Just absent. Physically, you were there for me, but emotionally, like you were behind glass, inaccessible. His words hit the mark. Yeah, that's exactly what I was. Built a wall between me and the world, including my own son, to protect myself from pain and disappointment. I didn't know how to be different, I said quietly. After your father destroyed my self-confidence, I just hid. It was the only way I knew how to survive. We sat in silence, each immersed in our own thoughts. It was starting to rain outside the window, the drops drumming on the glass, creating a cozy background noise. You know what's ironic? Elliot finally said. I spent my whole life trying to be different from my father, and I ended up being a copy of him. just as obsessed with success, just as incapable of real intimacy. No, I argued. You're not a copy of Samuel. You have something he never had, the ability to admit your mistakes and learn from them. Elliot smiled weakly. I'm not sure that's enough. The phone rang again, interrupting our conversation. Elliot looked at the screen and sighed. Knox, he said before answering it. Yeah, what's up? I could see his face growing darker with every word he said. I see, he said finally. No, I still haven't found the money. Yes, I know what that means. Good. Keep me informed. He hung up the phone and leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes. What's wrong? I asked, even though the answer was obvious. Brennan, that con man, has filed a formal demand for damages. If we don't post bail by tomorrow morning, the court will seize all the studio's assets. We'll lose everything. I looked at his haggard face and felt my heart clench with pain for my son. Despite all our difficulties, despite the years of estrangement, he was still my child, and his suffering was my suffering. What about Dad's letter? I asked, pointing to the untouched envelope. Maybe there's something important in there. Elliot looked at the letter with distaste. I doubt it. What could he have written other than more recriminations and disappointments? You won't know until you read it, I said softly. He sighed, reached for the envelope and opened it. He unfolded the piece of paper and began to read. I watched the expression on his face, which changed from skeptical to surprised, then to thoughtful. What is he writing? I asked when Elliot finished. He's apologizes, Elliot answered in disbelief. He says he was too demanding, too critical, that he was proud of me and my accomplishments, though he never knew how to show it. He turned the page. And he also writes about the box, says there's something inside that might be important to me. Elliot took the wooden box he'd brought from the lawyer yesterday and opened it. Inside were some papers and an old photo. That's us, he said, looking at the photo. At the lake, remember? I was about 5. I nodded. I remembered that day one of the rare times we were actually happy as a family. Elliot set the photo aside and started looking through the paperwork. He paused, reading. It's a patent for sound processing technology my father developed back in the 80s, and a letter from a law firm dated last month saying that a major technology company was interested in buying the rights. He flipped through the papers, his hands trembling slightly. Here's a preliminary appraisal, $100,000, and the contacts of the lawyer who's negotiating. Elliot looked up at me in amazement. He left me this, not money, not material possessions, but, an opportunity, a chance to save my business. I could see the conflicting emotions struggling on his face, disbelief, relief, confusion. Why, he asked, as if in disbelief. Why did he do it? After all the years of estrangement, after all our fights? Because he loved you, I answered simply, in his own imperfect way. But he loved you. Elliot stared at the papers in his hands, as if they could answer all the questions. I don't understand, he said quietly. All my life he's criticized my choices, my business, said I was wasting my time on an unreliable enterprise. And now, this. Samuel was a complicated man, I said. He couldn't show his feelings, couldn't admit his mistakes, but deep down, he wanted the best for you. It's just that his idea of the best didn't always match yours. Elliot put the papers aside and stood up, walking to the window. The rain had intensified, turning the street into a blurry picture. You know what the weirdest thing is? He said without turning around. I always thought that if I got a confession from him, if he told me he was proud of me, I'd be happy, satisfied. Now all I feel is emptiness and regret. that we couldn't say that to each other when we were alive. I walked over and stood next to him, looking out at the rain. Regret is a part of life, Elliot. We all carry its burden. I regret that I wasn't stronger, that I didn't protect you better. Samuel, I think, regretted his inability to express love in ways other than through criticism and expectations. And you? And I regret being too proud to step up, he finished for me. Too busy being hurt to see that he was changing. We stood in silence, watching the rain. Two lonely men, bound by blood and history, but separated by years of misunderstanding and resentment. What are you going to do now? I asked after a while. Elliot took a deep breath. I'm going to call that lawyer, find out how real this deal is. If it checks out, I can save the studio. And then I have a lot of rethinking to do. He turned to me. You were right, Mom. I'm not like my father, and I don't want to repeat his mistakes, or my own. I could see the determination in his eyes, and something else. The vulnerability he'd hidden for so long behind a mask of confidence and cynicism. You know, he said quietly, all my life I've blamed you and my father for my problems, for my inability to have close relationships, for my fear of vulnerability. Told myself that you shaped me this way. But the truth is, I chose this path on my own. I chose to keep everyone at a distance. I built these walls myself. We are all responsible for our choices, I agreed. But sometimes we need help to see other possibilities. Elliot nodded and went back to the table where the papers were. I'll call the lawyer now, he said, picking up the phone. And then we need to have a serious talk, Mom, about the past, about the future, about everything we'd been silent about for too long. I nodded, feeling oddly relieved. Maybe the loss of the inheritance and the threat of bankruptcy was just what Elliot and I needed to finally face the truth, to start tearing down the walls we'd so carefully built over the years. I'll be here, I said, when you're ready. Elliot dialed the number on the paperwork and went into the kitchen to talk privately. I stayed at the window, watching the rain and thinking about the strange twists of fate, about how death can sometimes give rise to something new, how loss can become gain. Samuel, in his final gesture, may have given us a chance to not only save Elliot's business, but to heal the wounds we'd inflicted on each other for too long. I didn't know if we would take that chance, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I heard Elliot's voice from the kitchen, his tone gradually changing from wary to more animated. The news was good, it seemed. Maybe all was not yet lost for him. For us, the rain outside the window began to subside, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, creating a play of light and shadow on the wet street. I looked out at the changing landscape and thought about how unpredictable life is, how we plan for one thing and end up with something else entirely. How sometimes the toughest trials can lead to the most unexpected discoveries. You never protected me from him. Elliot's words echoed in my head. And he was right. I wasn't protecting him, not from Samuel, not from the world, not even from his own mistakes. I was too busy protecting myself, too caught up in my own fears and insecurities. But maybe it wasn't too late to change things. Maybe we could both still learn to be better versions of ourselves, without the weight of past hurts and mistakes. Elliot spent the next 3 days in Alta Vista, contrary to his original plans. The technical problems at the airport had been fixed, but he decided to stay behind to settle things with Samuel's patent. The lawyer listed in the documents confirmed that negotiations with the technology company were in the final stages, and Elliot's personal presence as heir could speed up the process. My house was suddenly filled with his energy. Phone conversations, the clatter of laptop keys, quick steps on the stairs. Elliot moved his temporary office into the living room. laying out papers on the coffee table and turning the couch into a command center. I didn't mind this intrusion. After so many years of silence and solitude, the presence of my son, even if busy with his own affairs, was strangely comforting. On the morning of the fourth day, I found him in the kitchen brewing coffee. He looked more relaxed than he had the previous few days. Apparently, things were getting better. "Good morning," he said, handing me a cup. I made breakfast. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast. I was surprised by the gesture. Elliot had never shown much interest in doing things at home, preferring restaurants and cafes. "Thank you," I said, accepting the cup. "How are the negotiations going?" "Not bad." He sat down across from me, his own cup in his hands. "The company is ready to buy the patent for $120,000. That should be enough to pay off Brennan and stabilize the studio." "I'm glad," I said sincerely. "It means you'll be back to your life soon." Something flashed in his eyes. Doubt? Disappointment? But he quickly hid it behind a sip of coffee. "Yeah, I guess so. The deal's gonna take a few more days, though. Legal formalities, you know." We ate breakfast in tense silence. There was still an invisible wall between us, built by years of mutual resentment and misunderstanding. "I thought I'd visit my father's house today," he said, pushing away his empty plate. "Pritchard said the bank hadn't started the sale process yet, so I could get my personal belongings. Do you want me to come with you?" I asked, unsure if he'd accept my offer. To my surprise, Elliot nodded. "If it's okay with you?" You know best what might have been important to him. Samuel's house was in the old part of Alta Vista, a few blocks from downtown, a Victorian mansion he'd bought early in his career when we were a young family with big dreams. After our divorce, he was left to live there alone, turning part of the house into an office for his antiques business. We drove there in the afternoon. The day was clear, sunny, but with a cool breeze, typical fall weather for Alta Vista. Elliot parked the car at the curb, and we sat in silence for a while, looking at the front of the house. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown, the porch steps in need of repair. "It's strange to see it like this," Elliot said dryly. "I remember my father always kept the house in good repair, never tolerated even the slightest sign of decay. In recent years, he hasn't had the energy or means to keep everything in perfect condition," I said. "Illness and financial problems." Elliot nodded and got out of the car. I followed him. The key Pritchard had given us turned uneasily in the lock, as if the door was reluctant to let visitors in. Inside, the house was quiet and dusty, filled with stale air and memories. The furniture I remembered from our marriage now looked old and tired. The paintings on the walls were faded, the carpets frayed. There was a sense of decay that Samuel had carefully hidden from the outside world. "Where do we start?" Elliot asked, looking around with undisguised surprise. Perhaps he too was amazed at the state of the house. "Let's check his office," I suggested. "The most important documents should be in there." Samuel's study was at the back of the house, with windows overlooking the garden. It had once been a bright, spacious room filled with books, antiques, and business papers. Now it looked like a hermit's cave. The shelving was empty, unpaid bills and medical prescriptions were piled on the desk, and the blinds were half closed, creating a semi-darkness. Elliot walked slowly around the room, touching things, looking at the pictures on the walls. One of them he took down and looked at for a long time. It was a picture of him and his father, standing next to an antique secretaire, obviously a prized possession of Samuel's. "I remember that day," Elliot said with a chill in his voice. "I was 15. My father took me to the auction, the first time he'd ever let me bid. I was so proud when I won that secretaire for him. I didn't know the story. At that time, Samuel and I had already begun to drift apart, and he rarely shared with me the details of his dealings with his son. Did he often take you with him? I asked, sitting down on the edge of the table. Not too much. Elliot put the picture back down, but when he did, it was always special. He was a different person in the antiques world, lively, passionate, enthusiastic. At home, he was usually aloof, absorbed in his own thoughts. I understood what he was talking about. Samuel always came alive when it came to his collection, to rare finds, to deals. Everything else, including his family, often took a back seat. Let's take a look at his papers, I suggested, pointing to the desk. Maybe there's something else there about a patent or other assets. We began sorting through the papers, organizing them into stacks. Bills, medical records, business correspondence. Most of the papers were about debts and financial problems, confirming what Pritchard had said about Samuel's sad state of affairs. Look at this, Elliot said, handing me a piece of paper. It was a draft of a letter to me, dated 2 months earlier. I took it and started reading. Samuel's handwriting was uneven, as if the hand holding the pen was shaking from weakness or emotion. Elliot, I know it's been a long time since we've had a real conversation, and it's my fault. I was too proud, too stubborn to make the first move. But now I must warn you, I've heard about a man named Archibald Brennan who's been inquiring about your studio. He's a crook, Elliot. He's ruined several of my colleagues in a similar fashion, gaining their trust, offering investments, and then… The text broke off halfway through, as if Samuel had been interrupted or decided to start again. He was trying to warn you, I said quietly, about Brennan. Even before he contacted Knox, Elliot turned pale as he reread the letter. Why hadn't he sent it? Why didn't he just call me? Maybe he tried, I answered, remembering my last conversation with Samuel. He mentioned that he'd called you a few times, but you hadn't answered. Elliot looked away, his shoulders tense. I saw his calls, he admitted after a pause. But I thought he wanted to criticize my decisions or talk about my successes, as usual. I didn't want to hear that. There was restrained irritation in his voice. I understood his feelings all too well, the realization of a missed opportunity that could have changed everything. You couldn't have known, I said dryly. You both had established a certain pattern of communication, and it wasn't easy to break out of it. Elliot shook his head. It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. We continued to sort through the papers in tense silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. In one of the desk drawers, I found an old folder labeled Inventions. Inside were sketches, technical notes, and early versions of the patent Samuel had left for Elliot. Look, I said, handing the folder to my son. It looked like your father had been working on this technology for years. Elliot opened the folder and began to look through the contents. His eyebrows rose in surprise. Some of these notes date from before I was born, he said, flipping through the pages. I hadn't realized he was interested in sound technology. Samuel was a versatile man, I replied. As a young man, before he was fully immersed in the antiques business, he was interested in electronics and acoustics. I remember him spending hours with amplifiers and speakers, trying to get them to sound perfect. Elliot looked at me in disbelief. You never told me about this. A lot of things between us have gone unspoken, I said bitterly. We all keep our secrets, our unfulfilled dreams. We continued our search, and in the closet, among the old business magazines, I found a small box of photos and letters. They were snapshots of our family, young Samuel and I, little Elliot, our trips, holidays, ordinary days, the life that had once been ours. He kept it all, I said, going through the photos. Even after the divorce, even when we barely spoke to each other. Elliot took a quick glance at the photos. but he didn't seem particularly interested. His face remained detached, closed. "Let's keep looking," he said. We need all the documents he could gather on Brennan. We went back to the papers, and in a desk drawer, we found another important document, a folder of information about Brennan that Samuel had collected. There were newspaper clippings of lawsuits against him, testimonies from other victims of his fraudulent schemes, and contacts of the lawyers who had handled the cases. "This is evidence," Elliot said, looking through the documents. "With this, we can not only defend ourselves against Brennan's lawsuit, but we can countersue him, maybe even prosecute him criminally." I could see the calculating interest in his eyes, the tension of the last few days beginning to transform into business acumen. "Your father was thorough in his research," I said. "That was always his forte in business." "Yes," Elliot agreed with a cold smile. "He never made a deal without researching all the details. That's what he tried to teach me, and I thought he was paranoid and boring." In the far corner of the office, behind a bookcase, I noticed a safe I'd known existed since our marriage. "Elliot," I called out, "we need to check the safe. There might be something else important in there." "Do you know the code?" he asked, coming closer. "Maybe." I went to the safe and dialed a combination of numbers. Elliot's birth date. The lock clicked and the door opened. Inside were several folders, a box of some documents, and a small envelope. I pulled out the contents and placed them on the table. "What is it?" Elliot asked, looking at what I'd found. I opened the first folder and found that it was the deeds to Samuel's house and other property, including several insurance policies. The second folder contained medical records, diagnoses, test results, doctor's recommendations. Based on these documents, Samuel had known about the seriousness of his condition for over a year, but had refused expensive treatment that could have prolonged his life. "He'd been sick longer than he'd told me," I said, flipping through the records. "And the condition was much more serious." Elliot picked up the folder and looked through it quickly. "Heart surgery," he mumbled. "The cost was over $100,000. And he refused?" "I guess so," I answered. "He just didn't have that kind of money." I opened the box and found old family heirlooms inside. A few antique clocks that had belonged to Samuel's grandfather, a collection of old coins, some jewelry. Things he hadn't sold despite his financial difficulties. Finally, I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was another piece of paper, a draft of a letter to Elliot, dated a week before Samuel's death. "Elliot, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I would like to apologize for many things. For being an overly demanding father, for not knowing how to express my love and pride other than through criticism and expectations, for destroying our family with my ambition. I must also warn you about a man named Archibald Brennan. He's a con man who has ruined several of my co-workers. I've recently learned that he's interested in your studio. Be careful. In my office, in a folder labeled Legal Affairs, you'll find all the information I've gathered on him. One more thing, I'm leaving you a patent on a sound processing technology I've been working on since before you were born. The lawyer negotiating the sale of the rights thinks it could be worth a significant amount of money. I hope it will help you in your business. Forgive me, son, and know that I've always been proud of you, even if I don't know how to show it. Your father, Samuel." I held out the letter to Elliot, watching him read his father's last words. His face remained impassive, but I could see his hands trembling slightly. "He never sent it," Elliot said, folding the sheet. Typical of a father to write letters that would never be sent. There was a bitterness in his voice that I understood all too well. Samuel had always been a man who preferred to think about his words, to analyze his feelings, but rarely express them directly. "But now you know," I said. "You know that he was trying to warn you, that he was thinking about your well-being." Elliot shrugged. It's too late, he replied. For him, for me, for all of us. Too much time wasted on hurt feelings and misunderstandings. I wanted to argue, to say it was never too late to start over, but I didn't. Elliot was gathering the documents he'd found, putting them in the briefcase he'd brought with him. His movements were quick, efficient, devoid of emotion. I think we found everything we need, he said, closing the briefcase. It's time to go back. We went around the house one more time before we left, picking up any of Samuel's personal belongings that might be of value: photos, letters, a few books with his notes. Everything else, Pritchard said, would likely be auctioned off to pay off debts. As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of finality. It was like closing a chapter of my life, a long and complicated chapter filled with love, disappointment, pain, and misunderstanding. Elliot, on the other hand, seemed tense and pensive. He was silent all the way home, immersed in his thoughts. It wasn't until we entered my house that he finally spoke. "You knew," he said, turning to me. "You knew my father was seriously ill, that he'd been trying to contact me. Why didn't you tell me?" There was a reproach in his voice, an old resentment that never quite went away. "I tried, Elliot," I answered. "I called you a few times, told you that your father wasn't well, that he wanted to talk, but you were always too busy, too wrapped up in your own affairs. You should have insisted," he said, anger in his voice. "You should have told me how serious it was. Would you have believed me?" I asked, feeling my own anger rising inside me. "Or would you have thought I was trying to manipulate you again, to get you to make up with your father like you'd accused me of before?" Elliot looked away, his shoulders tense. "You've always defended him," he said quietly. "Even after the divorce, even when he hurt you, always taking his side against me. The injustice hit me like a slap in the face. Protecting him?" I almost laughed with bitterness. "Elliot, I spent years trying to protect you from his inflated expectations, from his criticism. And when I couldn't, when I realized I couldn't change him or stop him, I left. I left so I wouldn't have to watch you destroy each other with this endless struggle for control and acceptance." The morning was gray and cool. I woke up early, as usual, and lay in bed for a long time, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Strangely, that monotonous sound always brought me peace, even in the hardest of times. Yesterday's confrontation with Elliot had left a bitter residue. After we'd returned from Samuel's house and exchanged mutual accusations, he'd locked himself in his room with his laptop and phone, and I'd spent the evening in the living room with a book I couldn't read, revisiting the past again and again. Walking down to the kitchen, I found Elliot already awake. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, going over the papers we'd brought back from Samuel's house yesterday. He looked tired but focused, as if he'd made some important decision. "Good morning," he said, not looking up from the papers. "Morning," I said, heading for the coffee maker. "How did you sleep?" "Fine." He was obviously lying, judging by the shadows under his eyes. "I've been going through all the documents on Brennan that my father collected. It's very valuable information. With it, I have a chance to not only fend off his lawsuit, but to bring him to justice." I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I'm glad it's going to help you." Elliot finally looked up. "Mom, about last night." He hesitated, as if searching for words. "I shouldn't have blamed you. It wasn't fair." I sat down across from him, wrapping my arms around the cup for warmth. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from Elliot. Usually he just pretended like nothing had happened, avoiding any talk of conflict. "We've both said things we regret," I replied neutrally. "It had been a rough week for all of us." Elliot nodded, accepting my olive branch but not developing the topic further. Instead, he turned back to the paperwork. I contacted the lawyer who's negotiating the patent, he said in a businesslike tone. He confirmed that the deal is close to being finalized. I'll probably get the money as early as next week. That's good, I said. Enough to solve the problems with the studio. Yes, I think so. Elliot looked confident. With this money and the evidence against Brennan, I'll be able to stabilize the situation. Of course, I'll have to reevaluate a lot of things in the business, especially my relationship with Knox, but the studio will survive. I was relieved. Despite our difficulties, I didn't want Elliot to lose his life's work, something he'd spent years building. When do you plan on coming back? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Tomorrow, he answered. Booked a ticket on the morning flight. Gotta be there to deal with this whole mess personally. I nodded. Of course he'd be leaving. He always left. Elliot never stayed in Alta Vista longer than was absolutely necessary. I understand, I said. Do you need help getting ready? No thanks, I'm all set. He put the papers in a neat stack. I just wanted to, thank you, for helping me with my father's paperwork, for letting me stay here. You don't need to thank me, Elliot, I said. After all, I am your mother. Something flashed in his eyes. Sorry? Guilt? But it disappeared quickly. Elliot had always been able to hide his emotions, to keep them under control. In that, he was a true son of his father. I've been thinking about what we found at my father's house, he said after a pause. About his letters, about him trying to warn me about Brennan. I waited without interrupting. You know, all my life I thought he was selfish, a man who thought only of himself, of his reputation, of his business, Elliot continued. And it turned out that even when we weren't in touch, even when he was sick, he was still trying to protect me. Samuel was a complicated man, I said, with his flaws, with his mistakes. But he loved you, in his own way. Elliot shook his head. I've been so angry with him my whole life. For his criticism, for never being pleased with me, never praising me. And now it turns out he was proud of me, just didn't know how to show it. I looked at my son, at his face, which at that moment seemed especially like Samuel's, and felt the sharp pain of loss, not just of a husband I hadn't loved in a long time, but of all the years we could have spent as a normal family if we'd known how to talk to each other. I've been thinking about selling the house, I said suddenly, changing the subject. This house, in Alta Vista. Elliot looked at me in surprise. Sell it? Why? You love this town, this house. I did, I corrected him. But now that Samuel was gone, there wasn't much reason to stay. Too many memories, too many ghosts of the past. But where will you go? There was something like worry in his voice. I haven't decided yet, I shrugged. Maybe I'll move closer to the sea. I've always wanted to live by the water. Elliot frowned. It's a big decision, Mom. Are you sure? Pretty sure, I said. At my age, it's time to stop putting off what you really want. Life's too short for regrets. Elliot nodded, though I could see that the news disturbed him. Perhaps he'd always thought of me as a constant a mother who would always be waiting for him in his hometown, in his childhood home. Now that confidence is shaken. If you need help with moving or anything else, he began. I can handle it, I interrupted him gently. But thanks for the offer. The rest of the morning passed in a relatively peaceful atmosphere. Elliot worked on his paperwork, and I did the housework. It was as if we'd reached an unspoken truce, deciding not to broach any painful topics on our last day together. After lunch, I decided to show Elliot something else, a box of his childhood things that I'd kept all these years. There were his first drawings, school notebooks, contest awards, and old toys. I think you should take this, I said, setting the box in front of him. If I move, I don't want to risk anything getting lost or thrown away. Elliot opened the box with obvious interest. He pulled out the items one by one, examining them with an expression of wonder and nostalgia. "I'd forgotten about these things," he said, holding up the small model car he and his father had put together. "I thought it had all been thrown away a long time ago." "I saved what I could," I replied. "I thought you might need it someday. Or your kids." Elliot looked up from the box. "I don't have children, Mom. I don't think I will." "You never know what the future will bring," I said. "Anyway, these things are part of your history. You should have them." He nodded and continued going through the contents of the box. Suddenly, his hand froze over an old notebook. "Do you remember this?" he asked, picking it up. "My first music project in high school. I wrote a song for the spring concert." I remembered. Elliot was 12 and he was so proud of his composition. Samuel had laughed at his naive tune then, saying that music wasn't a serious career. I saw the enthusiasm in my son's eyes fade, and he became withdrawn. But secretly from his father, he continued to write music, and eventually it led him to set up a recording studio. "Of course I remember," I said. "You were always talented at music, even when you were very young." Elliot flipped through a notebook, studying his childhood music notation. "It's funny how things worked out," he said thoughtfully. "My father spent my whole life telling me that music wasn't serious, that I was wasting my time, and in the end he left me a patent on a sound technology that could save my studio." "Life is full of irony," I agreed. Elliot closed the notebook and carefully put it back in the box. "I'll take it with me," he said. "Thanks for saving everything." Evening came, the last night before Elliot left. I made dinner nothing fancy, just the simple home-cooked meals he'd loved as a child. He helped set the table, and we sat down to dinner, accompanied by the quiet sound of rain outside the window. "I've been thinking about the offer I got from the company buying my father's patent," Elliot said, breaking the cozy silence. "They don't just want to buy the rights, they're offering a partnership. Use the technology in a new line of audio equipment." "That sounds interesting," I said. "Would you go for it?" "I think so," he nodded. "It opens up new possibilities for the studio, a different level. Not only recording music, but also developing technology." "Your father would be pleased," I said sincerely, "to know that his work would continue through you." Elliot looked at me with a strange look, as if he wanted to say something else, but didn't dare. "Mom," he finally began, "I've been thinking about what you said about moving. If you do decide to sell the house and move, would you consider moving closer to me, to the city, or at least the suburbs? There are places by the water there, too." I wasn't expecting such a suggestion. Elliot was always careful to protect his space, his independence. For him to suggest that I move closer to him was unprecedented. "Why?" I asked him bluntly. "We'd barely spoken in the last few years. Why do you want me closer?" Elliot looked away, obviously embarrassed by my bluntness. I thought, after everything that's happened, after what we've learned about Dad, maybe we should start over, not make the same mistakes he made. I looked at my son, at his face, which now expressed a vulnerability rare for him, and felt conflicting emotions struggling inside me. Part of me, the old sentimental part, wanted to believe him, wanted to accept this olive branch and start building a new relationship. But the other part, the wiser, more cautious part, realized that nothing had truly changed. "Elliot," I said softly, "I appreciate your offer. I really do. But we both know this is an emotional moment. Your father's death, the crisis with your business, the discoveries we've made. It's all triggered feelings in you that may be temporary. You don't believe I'm sincere?" There was resentment in his voice. "I believe you are sincere now," I replied. "But when you get back to your life, when you solve the problems with the studio, When the shock of your father's death passes, everything will go back to normal. We'll be who we were again, the busy son who calls at Christmas and the mother who waits for those calls. Elliot frowned. You're not giving us a chance to change. I'm just being realistic, I said. Elliot, we can't fix in a week what we've been building for decades. Our relationships, our communication patterns, our defense mechanisms. None of that is going to disappear just because we decide we want to be closer. I could see how my words hurt him. But better the bitter truth now than more disappointment later. So you're just rejecting my proposal? He asked tensely. No chance of reconciliation? No, I shook my head. I'm not rejecting the possibility of improving our relationship, but I think it needs time and space. We both need to sort ourselves out, figure out what we really want from each other. Elliot put down his fork, his appetite clearly gone. And that's why you want to get as far away from me as possible? There was bitterness in his voice. I want to start a new life, I answered firmly. A life that isn't defined solely by my role as your mother or Samuel's ex-wife. A life where I can finally be me. We stared at each other across the table, two people bound by blood but separated by years of misunderstandings and unspoken grievances. I saw Samuel's reflection in his eyes, the same pride, the same unwillingness to take no for an answer. You've always been like this, he said finally, always keeping your distance, always building walls, with Dad, with me, with everyone. Yes, I agreed. It was my way of surviving, a way to preserve myself in a relationship that could have swallowed me whole. Maybe it was a mistake. But I can't change the past, Elliot. I can only decide how to move on with my life. He stood up from the table, clearly frustrated. I need to finish getting ready to leave, he said. I have to get up early tomorrow. I didn't stop him. I knew he needed time to think about what I'd said, to deal with the disappointment. After he left, I cleared the table, washed the dishes, performing the usual actions with mechanical precision. My thoughts swirled around our conversation, around the pain in Elliot's eyes when I'd rejected his offer of reconciliation. Had I been right? Or had I missed my chance to rebuild a relationship with my only son? Maybe I was too cynical, too closed to change, but deep down inside, I knew I had done the right thing. Elliot and I had a relationship that was too damaged, too warped by years of mutual resentment and silence to fix with one impulsive decision. We both needed the space, the time to truly change, to step out of the toxic patterns that had set in between us. I went upstairs to my bedroom and went to the window. The rain had intensified, turning into a real downpour. The drops drummed on the glass, blurring the outline of the familiar street, turning it into an abstract painting of light and shadow. My thoughts returned to Samuel, to what we'd found in his house, to his attempts to warn Elliot about Brennan, to his decision to file a patent for his son instead of spending the money on his own treatment. How many unspoken things remained between them? How many missed opportunities for understanding and reconciliation? I didn't want the same fate for me and Elliot. I didn't want us to continue living in the shadow of past hurts, not daring to tell each other the truth. But I also realized that real change took time, required the willingness of both participants. And right now, neither Elliot nor I were truly ready. I woke up early in the morning, knowing that Elliot had to leave at the crack of dawn to catch his flight. When I went down to the kitchen, I found him already packed and drinking coffee, standing by the window. "Good morning," I said. "I didn't hear you get up." "I didn't want to wake you," he replied, not turning around. The cab would be here in 20 minutes. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined him at the window. We stood in silence, looking out at the rain-wet street and the gray morning sky. "I left the Brennan files on the desk," Elliot said finally. Copies of what we found at my father's house. I thought you might need them too, in case he tried to contact you. Thank you, I said. That's thoughtful. Another pause, filled with unspoken words. Mom, Elliot turned to me. About yesterday. I understand your position. I don't agree with it, but I understand it, and I respect your decision to live your life the way you want. I nodded, grateful for that little acknowledgement. Thank you, Elliot. It means a lot to me. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the table. I'll be calling, he said. Not just for Christmas, and if you do decide to move, let me know. I'll help in any way I can. I will, I promised, realizing it was his way of saying he didn't want to lose touch. The cab arrived at exactly the right time. Elliot gathered his things, including the box of baby treasures and the folder with the patent papers. He paused at the door, clearly unsure how to say goodbye. I stepped forward and hugged him, a simple motherly gesture we hadn't exchanged in years. He tensed for a moment, then relaxed and hugged me back. Take care of yourself, I said, pulling back. And let me know when you get there. I will. He nodded. You take care of yourself too, Mom. And then he was gone, taking with him Samuel's patent, the evidence against Brennan, and the little box of shards of his childhood. I stood at the window, watching the cab pull away, taking my son back to his life. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that we still couldn't break down the barriers between us. Relief that I had finally found the strength to let go of the past and start thinking about my own future. The house was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the clock and the sound of the rain outside the window. But this silence no longer felt oppressive or lonely. It was filled with possibilities, with the anticipation of something new. I walked over to the desk where the papers Elliot had left behind were lying. Among them, I noticed an envelope with my name written in his neat handwriting. Inside was a short note. Mom, I understand your decision and respect your need for space, but know that the door is always open. When you're ready, I'll be waiting. Elliot. I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket. Then I went to the phone and dialed the number of the realtor I'd already consulted with about selling the house. Good morning, Mr. Brighton, I said when he answered. This is June Radcliffe. I'm ready to put the house on the market. After talking to the realtor, I made another call to my old friend Carol, who had moved a few years ago to a coastal town 3 hours from Alta Vista. June, she exclaimed when she heard my voice. What a pleasant surprise. Carol, remember you said there was a little cottage with a sea view for sale in your town? Is it still available? Yes, as far as I know. Are you interested? There was surprise in her voice. More than interested, I replied. I've decided to sell the house in Alta Vista and start a new life. I thought your town might be a good place for that. We agreed that I would come back next week to see the cottage and the neighborhood. As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of energy and determination that I hadn't felt in a long time. I went out into the garden, despite the drizzling rain. The ground was wet, the flowers drooping under the weight of the drops. But the air was fresh and clean, filled with the smell of damp soil and wet greenery. Standing there among my flowers that I'd been growing for years, I thought about Samuel, about Elliot, about our strange, broken family, about how all three of us, each in our own way, had been prisoners of our pride, our fears, our inability to express what we felt. But now, with Samuel gone and Elliot gone, I finally felt free. Freedom from the past, from expectations, from the role I'd played for too long. Freedom to just be June, not a wife, not a mother, but a woman who could still start a new chapter of her life. The rain intensified, but I didn't rush to take shelter in the house. I stood with my face up to the sky, letting the drops wash away the traces of the past, cleansing me for the future I was finally ready to face. Elliot was right about one thing: we all pay a high price for our pride. But he was wrong to think we can't change that pattern. We can, each in our own way, in our own time. And my time is now.